Snapshots podcast, hosted and run by the Global Health Working Group as part of the British International Studies Association. This podcast gathers the personal insights and interests of global health researchers through conversations with those at its cutting edge. My name is Christopher Long, co-convenor of the BISA Global Health Working Group, lecturer in International Relations at Queen's University Belfast, and the host and production manager of this podcast. This episode we are speaking with Sara Davies, Professor of International Relations at Griffith University. Welcome, Sara, to the Snapshots podcast.
Thank you. Really lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So to begin with, what sparked your interest in the arena of global health?
Thank you. So I just finished my PhD, which was on international refugee law in Southeast Asia. And I was watching at the same time that I was writing up the thesis, the aftermath of the severe acute respiratory syndrome that had happened in 2003, the spread from China to Hong Kong to Vietnam to Thailand and so on. And I was really interested in, I guess, understanding the way in which countries that were being impacted by this sudden, rapid, novel emerging infectious disease outbreak, how they were cooperating, where were the issues around cooperation, the impetus that gave towards mobilizing the international health regulations, which were then revised in 2005. So to me, there was that contrast also between what I was observing in real action, in real lifetime, with then the areas of cooperation and the difficulties around cooperation with asylum and management of refugee flows in the same region. So I was interested by the contrast, but I was also just really interested in the idea of diplomacy and political negotiation during an infectious disease outbreak.
Yeah, it's really an interesting set of topics here, mentioning kind of cooperation and how it had to deal with these kind of new situations and contrasting between what the law says, maybe the international law says, and how things work out politically. What are some of the kind of the most important issues and questions? I mean, you mentioned issues around cooperation. Have there been other key drivers or key questions that have driven your work?
So I guess for me, The Global Politics of Health, which was the book that I first wrote in this area, was my attempt to really try and understand how we think about health as a collective action problem in international relations, or an area of collective action. And I was really in that book trying to grapple with, I suppose, the absence of health from a lot of the introduction to IR textbooks that I had been reading during my undergraduate and postgraduate days. And it seemed to me that there was just a huge area here that was missing from the way in which we understand the world, the way in which we understand how states come together and sometimes don't come together in this area. There was high stakes diplomacy at times around the area of health, huge amounts of investments and funding going towards health in donor programs during the 2000 to recent years. And to me, it just seemed like this was an enormous area that was driving a lot of diplomacy, a lot of global funding, and a lot of research that was really had the potential to change some lives, but also was driving huge amounts of inequality for others. And so that book was my attempt to try and understand how we could think about health with an international relations lens. And then from there, I kind of really got interested in the question, and I still am interested in how states conceive infectious disease outbreaks, novel ones, as either a response that they can manage independently, or one that they try and seek alliances and cooperation and shared expectations around how to manage them. And I'm also really interested as well. I've done work like Containing Contagion, where I was really also interested in what doesn't get prioritized when trying to think about how cooperation can be managed. So in that book, I was particularly interested in, questions around human rights, risk communication, and how that can be managed across countries that some are democratic, some are not. Some have strict regulations over the use of internet and news media, and some don't. And what does that look like? And how do we take that into consideration then when thinking about technical advice in relation to prevention, preparedness, and response for health emergencies?
Yeah, there's some really fascinating questions in there around, how do states kind of approach the issue of disease threat? Is it trying to go alone or, seeking cooperation, and the multifaceted different political dynamics, around the world, different countries, and the way they communicate risk, especially issues around risk, is really, really interesting. Yeah. Investigating some of these questions, has your work kind of revealed any preconceived myths or disconnects?
I think for me, what was interesting, so I did a book with Adam Cameron-Scott and Simon Rushton where we were looking at the international health regulations, which is an attempt through the World Health Assembly for states to agree to how they will kind of manage border entry and exit and alerts around disease outbreak events, and basically a whole set of articles there around, what you will do to notify everyone else that there's been an outbreak, what will you do in terms of communicating it, how will you respond as a country, what types of regulations will you put in place around exit and entry, around borders, and so on. And as I was saying earlier, after SARS, that instrument was seen as it had kind of run its course. And by 1995, there'd been a real effort to try and revise it. It used to be focused on specific diseases. There was a real attempt to make it more kind of an all hazards approach. Any kind of health emergency could fall under this notification requirement. And it took sort of 10 years in the end to try and to get that to be agreed to and formalized and put into place. And so in that book, we looked at basically what happened between 2003, the onset of SARS, and 2005, the adoption of a very radically changed international health regulations from what it had been in its previous iteration. And there was some really innovative concepts in there around the idea, for example, that non-state actors could report to the World Health Organization if they suspected that an outbreak was occurring, and there was a process in place for them to be able to notify the World Health Organization, which before then it had always been states. States do this. This is member states of the World Health Assembly who get to do this notification practice. And that was a really kind of novel change. And it really made you think about, well, what is sovereignty and how does sovereignty work in this area, and to what extent this was in 2005 an understanding of the fact that the news cycle and information would get ahead of states, and states wouldn't be able to control that. But if the state was trying to control that, if they were trying to prevent an outbreak event from getting out, there needed to be an alternative pathway for the World Health Organization to be told and informed. And then, of course, the World Health Organization has to go back to the state and seek confirmation. I think a lot today on that, and I don't know if we would have achieved that today. I think a lot about the 2005 instrument and what was attempted there. And a lot of the conversation during COVID-19 was about the failure of the international health regulations. But there were some elements of the international health regulations during COVID-19, particularly in the early stages around, trying to bring together a committee to identify at the first instance anyway, this kind of novel coronavirus as a public health emergency. That was done, from the first meeting to then the decision to declare it in 7 days. That was a very different story to what had even been happening with previous health emergencies in terms of the rapidness of that decision. And lots of things went wrong, of course, with COVID-19 pandemic. But I think, what I've been really surprised with as well is after COVID-19, the efforts to rapidly revise the international health regulations again, and that was done within a relatively short period of time, just a couple of years. And there seems to still be quite a strong state commitment to try and make this work and to adhere to this. And we've seen this recently, lots of mentions of the international health regulations in the recent 2 outbreaks with hantavirus and the current Ebola outbreak.
Yeah, really interesting reflections on how the international health regulations has kind of evolved and was not fit for purpose maybe, and then again reflecting some of your previous research strands around how states cooperate, whether they don't, and the role of non-state actors is really fascinating, and maybe circumventing states, right, to spread knowledge and understanding of some disease outbreaks, right, depending
Yeah.
on certain political contexts. Yeah. Can you reflect on maybe some of the biggest surprises in your understanding of global health from when you first entered the field? I mean, maybe you already talked about the way that, global health has kind of been neglected from international relations and reading big textbooks and clear understandings of the field, and maybe that's one, or maybe there's others.
I mean, one of the joyous surprises to me has been the degree to which the international relations discipline has really taken on board the acknowledgement of the work around health and it being a really important area of inquiry in international relations. And I think that was starting to happen. I think, there was a group of us that used to sort of, have internal discussions around which journal was most likely to be willing to accept a paper that we're writing on something bizarre like the international health regulations revisions, or lots of papers that were starting to be written about, the securitization of HIV, really important work that's been done by a number of great scholars. And so I think to now, there's not even that conversation anymore. People who want to submit papers examining health from an IR perspective, for the most part, taken as a really important area of inquiry. And I think that's been a really important shift. And it's been a lovely surprise. There's always lots of talk about academe wanting to, hold their turf and stay in your lane and all that sort of thing. And yet I think in this area, actually, what's been really important as well, and I've really enjoyed, and I've been humbled a lot by reading a lot of the work, is the importance of decolonization of global health as well.
Yeah.
And definitely the need to pause, take stock, and think about the way in which global health narratives have been perpetuating colonization and perpetuating inequality, and to really think about that and take that on in terms of then, the work I do in global health security, the way in which that's not always being framed or understood as, emancipation. It can actually sometimes be understood and is being practiced as a form of racialization and discrimination.
Yep. Wow. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, ideas around the growth of the field and the early struggles, right, in kind of establishing global health as a serious element of IR, which thankfully now has been accepted. And
I hope
future.
so.
No, I think definitely so. We definitely don't think we have to worry about which journals anymore. Yeah. Um, and future efforts around decolonization, I think, it's really fascinating. Something I'm very interested to explore in my own teaching and research as well, to see some of
Absolutely.
those reflections. Yeah. So what are some of the most interesting and powerful theories or approaches that you've used in your work or in developing your work? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I guess for me, one of the critical security studies, and in particular, the work I was just mentioning it before, like Richard Wynne Jones, Ken Booth's work on emancipation of security and emancipation over power, was really important work that I was reading when I was starting to think about global health. But the person who deserves the most credit of all was Caroline Thomas. I mean, her work was just so important for validating my exploration into this area and thinking about it with an international relations lens. I still remember reading her work, exploring health, and just feeling really excited about the chance to be able to think about health with an IR lens. Also, of course, I have to say as well, Kelly Lee, who straddled that really difficult line between being a health researcher as well as an international relations researcher, both straddling both disciplines, but also thinking about the way in which globalization was really rapidly changing the concept of health, the way in which health was migrating, the way in which funding was radically changing overnight, the growth of these kind of vertical disease programs that that her work in particular charted, and the mobilization around particular global health initiatives like tobacco control. It was an exciting time where you were reading people who are really trying to think about what is globalization, what is security, human-centered security, and what can be done in a period of time where I think there was a degree of relative optimism about the way in which international organizations could play quite an important normative role around health rights, health as a human right, health for all. And then there was lots of work too that was being done, for example, the campaign work that was being done as well on areas like antiretroviral treatment for HIV/AIDS. So that's not necessarily theoretical work, but for me, watching those advocacy campaigns and then reading the work behind them, individuals like Nana Poku and others, that was really, again, it just felt like there was just so much to kind of think about in this space from a human rights lens. Thinking about that difference between positive and negative duties and how that can be realized in this area. What they were all trying to think about too was, this kind of shift from the sovereign as the center of the securitizing object to thinking more about people and emancipation, their emancipation and opportunity for being able to realize health, and that being linked to sovereign duty. That was really a lot of the work that was inspiring me at the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Kind of the problematizations of maybe state power in relation to health issues and human rights. That's really fascinating. I guess you've already talked about a little bit about some of your future work, maybe with decolonizing, looking at the lineages of global health security in contrast to kind of the colonial legacies. What are some of the other maybe exciting, interesting, and high priority issues in your research as you move forward?
So for me personally, right now, we're looking at a project that's exploring, is all health equal? So in particular, we're looking at the articulation or the promise of One Health. So this idea that's been promoted by the quadripartite, it's a great word, with the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, and the United Nations Environmental Programme. And since 2022, what they've basically said is there's a joint plan of action for states, but also regional organizations and communities and these organizations themselves to promote an idea of One Health. And this idea is that human health, animal health, environment health, and plant health are all interconnected.
Yep.
One isn't more important than another. You really need to be thinking about all of them being pursued and prioritized to prevent things like zoonoses, disease outbreaks from animals that can jump from animals to humans, but also the types of environmental degradation, the risk of antimicrobial resistance. These are really important areas that can only be pursued through a One Health lens. And so in our project, we're kind of critically examining that and looking at, well, okay, so what does that look like in practice? Does that really mean then that we're saying animal health in terms of governance, in terms of budget, in terms of prioritization matters as much as human health? And we've got a project looking at, for example, the answer is mixed. Sometimes in particular, there are certain animal diseases that can have dramatic impacts on communities and farmers, in particular smallholder farmers, who are not able to afford constant veterinary assistance, and losing their livestock can be catastrophic for them. But in terms of then the kind of mobilization of the resources and the prevention, the upstream prevention practices are actually still really hard to deliver. And partly that is because health still sits in hierarchy.
Yep.
And then also there's been choices that have been made, in particular in this One Health lens, around what diseases are connected to the One Health policy, to One Health funding, to One Health prioritization, and which ones aren't. So certain animal health diseases that have a very low risk or negligible risk of being a zoonotic disease don't get prioritized, but they could be really important, if you like, quote, peacetime, quote, moments to really implement upstream prevention.
Right.
So that communities are being given the tools and the supports needed to implement, consideration of wildlife interaction with farm animals, to think about the relationship between water use for humans and water sources for animals and these sorts of things. So we're doing a project looking at that, and we've got amazing research partners across Bangladesh, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and Fiji, who are both practitioners, gender development workers, veterinary officers, public health officials, really amazing multidisciplinary team looking at this and exploring this. So that's an area that we're looking at. In terms of the field itself, I would really like to see a return to human rights in the area of health. I think particularly that tends to be distributed or allocated in the legal space or in the international law space. And I think there's sort of this reluctance in international relations at the moment to kind of, or hesitation around human rights due to, as we were saying earlier, the legacy of colonization, the way in which the funding structure right now is kind of disappearing, the backlash on gender in health. But I think when things are starting to slip, that's more important for us to kind of return to and think about, well, why is it? And there's been a big debate about, for example, the use of the term equity rather than the use of the term human right, and what that means, and why have we had this switch? And there's been some really great pieces exploring at the pandemic agreement where it was really noted that equity was used far more often than human rights. And I think these are really important areas of conversation that we need to have, particularly with the funding space diminishing. Lots of concerns around the retraction of funding for long-term sustainable health programs, and serious conversations about what states should be prioritizing with minimal budget resources, inflation going high, state indebtedness going, beyond control. What areas of health are fundamental? There is a collective positive duty to ensure that they remain protected. So I think there's a really important space for IR to be in this area and to be having conversations. And that would be something that I would really like to see a continuation of.
Yeah, both really fascinating areas. I think, the interconnection between humans and the natural world and animals is going to be ever more important, I think, in understanding really effective solutions to disease spread and things like that. And the shrinking sector of funding and notions of human rights. And it's very interesting political questions around how we start framing these issues, maybe to get more buy-in, maybe from political actors and things like that. And maybe, also reframe things in terms of human rights. So I guess finally then, what advice would you give students thinking about trying to forge a career in the study of global health?
Be curious and assume that just because it's not there in international relations, it's not in what you're reading, doesn't mean it doesn't belong. And I think too, there is probably a little bit of a sense at times that going back in time is a bit boring. Why would I read that article from 1989? That was a really long time ago. And it's like, yeah, sure, fine, I get that. But I guess I would say there are some really important moments to go back and read the really interesting work that was being done around, UN Security Council engagement with HIV/AIDS, and to kind of chart that as a really important case study of both how political engagement with HIV/AIDS had this real double-edged sword to it. And at the same time, to look at the way the IR literature over time really changed in the way in which it engaged with that high-level political debate, from it being originally about, making sure that peacekeepers don't spread HIV everywhere, to becoming really important questions around what is the obligation of a sovereign state to populations at risk of infection, and also what are the risks to populations at risk of HIV when it's securitized. So I think I would be saying to students, just suspend your horror when you see things that were written way before you were born, and read them, because there's some really great work out there that's been done by amazing scholars, including, like I was saying earlier, Nana Poku, Sophie Harmon, Stefan Alb, Simon Rushton, and, I could go on and on and on. And then I think the other thing is, like I was saying earlier, is just to be curious. I understand everyone right now has COVID-19 fatigue, and that's totally understandable. But I think what I would say with that is that what everyone is looking at right now is how to prepare for COVID-19. And we're not going to the next big international relations event where diplomacy, political cooperation is going to really become vital across the world, is not going to be for COVID-19. It's going to be for something else unknown in the area of health.
Yeah.
And so I think, and it's understandable, right? We always prepare for the past event, not for the future one. But I would say to students, really be open to the current work that's being done around mirror life, synthetic biology, the areas around the real rise at the moment of talk about biosecurity and bioterrorism, the gender backlash in the area of health, and what impact that's going to have actually on maternal mortality, sexual rights, and actually a whole range of indicators around women and men's health going forward. And then the impact that we know that has on stability, risk of conflict, marginalization of populations. There's a lot here to be done and to be thinking about with an international relations lens.
Yeah, fascinating and really interesting. Very good advice, I think. Yeah, stay curious and don't be put off by the earlier stuff that gives you a really good grounding, I think, in the field and how it develops. Yeah, thank you so much. Really fascinating conversation. And I think that brings our conversation to a close. So thank you very much, Sarah, for your time.
Thank you. It was great to talk. Thank you.
Thanks for participating in the podcast. Thanks. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Snapshot podcast. Please see the show notes for more information on our guests.